Okay, hello everybody. My name is Tom. I'm an educator here at Cheetah. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to be talking to you all today about our topic of the day, which is carnivores. So we are going to start off by talking about what carnivores are, where they kind of fall into place within their ecosystems, what roles they play, and then we're going to talk about a whole lot of different kinds of carnivores and different adaptations that they have to make them efficient and good at being carnivores, essentially. So lots of fun things to talk about, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you actually, so we can start kind of visualizing where carnivores fall into place within their ecosystems. So let's start by talking about what a carnivore even is. And essentially, a carnivore is an animal that feeds on the flesh or meat of any other animals in their environment, right? So before we really start talking about where they fit in, let's talk about a food web and what that is and why that's important to what we're going to be talking about. So a food web, right, or even food chains, is how nutrients and energy move through the different levels of an ecosystem and how energy is passed along from level to level. So within our food webs, we have our different trophic scales or levels, right? And so we have at the very bottom, you can see in both these examples or all three of these examples, our primary producers, which is our plants. And so they are what really gain all of the energy and start the whole system out. And then working up from there, we have our primary consumers. So those are going to be our herbivores, and those are animals that are going to feed on plant material, right? And then we may start to see some of our carnivores. So that's when we see our primary consumers that are going to eat those herbivores or maybe some omnivores, right? And we're going to start to see some of our carnivores work their way in, right? So even things like this toad here, or this frog, may be a carnivore when it's eating insects and other animals like that. You can see this fish here might be a first example of a carnivore that's feeding on some crustaceans and some other fish, and so on and so forth. So really, our carnivores aren't going to be near the bottom of our food web, right? At the bottom of our ecosystem trophic scales. They're going to be a little bit further up, which means they're going to require a little bit more energy, right? And that's why we won't see maybe as many. So carnivores or our consumers tend to be a little bit larger of individuals, and there may be fewer of them because they are further up in those trophic scales, and therefore they require a bit more energy. Whereas, our primary producers, our plants are everywhere, and even our primary consumers, things like insects, there can be a lot of them. So just important to put that into perspective as we talk about as we work through the rest of our talk today. It's also kind of interesting to think about all the different variation in carnivores that there are. So carnivores can come in many different groups depending on what they eat. So carnivores will specialize in different food groups. So we can have a piscivore, which is an animal that's going to feed primarily or have all their diet consist of fish, but they're still a carnivore, right? So we can have piscivores, we can have insectivores, which are carnivores that feed mostly or completely on insects. And so there's different groups, right, that we can work through. And then we also have things like, let's see. Oh, so we'll get to that in a little bit, but we'll also have something that's called an obligate carnivore, which is an animal that relies completely on feeding on meat or flesh. So they cannot digest any plant material, so they have to be 100% carnivores. Whereas some other animals that may be considered carnivores may be able to also consume some plant material, and then we may be dipping into omnivores a little bit, which are animals that can feed on both plant and animal material. But when we're thinking about obligate carnivores, those are animals that feed solely on animal material or flesh, right? Okay, so now we've kind of established what a carnivore is, where they fit in within their ecosystem and the food webs within their ecosystem. And now let's start to talk about, some of the different roles that they can play. So the first is that carnivores are also oftentimes considered predators. And sometimes when you have a predator that plays a really, really important role within its ecosystem to the point where it actually helps shape and control that ecosystem, they can be considered what's called a keystone species. So a keystone species is a species that plays a disproportionately large size on their ecosystem relative to how many there are. So there may not be that many present, but just their presence alone is going to control a whole lot of other prey populations, maybe how many animals are in each of those prey populations, what other species are even present, so they can control the diversity of other species within that ecosystem. And if that species is lost for some reason, that entire ecosystem can shift and it can change and it can even collapse. So keystone species are very important to their ecosystem, and sometimes a keystone species can be a carnivore because of the role it plays as a predator. So what you see here on your screen is a gray wolf. And so they're a pretty well-known example of a keystone species. And so the classic example is that they were removed from Yellowstone National Park for a while. And after they were removed, elk started feeding on a lot of willow trees and aspen that was found near riverbeds and streams. And then once those aspen and those willows were removed, then there was a lack of vegetation. Then a whole lot of other animals collapsed that relied on that vegetation, such as, birds, some songbirds disappeared. And just in general, once that herbivore, the elk, once it was no longer controlled by the gray wolf, which is our keystone species, they just overgrazed. So they got rid of all the vegetation, and that shifted the entire ecosystem. And because of that shift, the diversity crashed, and a lot of animals were lost. And actually, there's even some really cool, well, not cool, but it's interesting to think about some other impacts that could come from that. So even losing plant material near riverbeds and in what we call riparian zones, which is areas near the edges of rivers and things, sedimentation increased, which means, those riverbanks may have started to erode because they weren't held in place by the plants anymore. So then there may have been some erosion of the streams. So just lots of examples of how just that one species, the gray wolf, being removed had impacts on the entire ecosystem. And this was this was really realized even more because the gray wolf was eventually reintroduced. And as soon as it was reintroduced, those elk numbers went down, some of those plants started regrowing, and diversity started coming back. And so that was really some pretty good proof that this is a really important species for the environment or for that ecosystem, to be able to maintain diversity. Okay, so that's one example of a keystone species. Let's talk about another carnivore that is also considered a keystone species in its environment. So give me 1 second while I grab our next animal. It's not going to be a virtual animal. Oh, I guess it would be helpful too if I stop sharing so you can see better. Okay. So this is Tick. Tick is an American alligator, and alligators are also considered keystone species. And for a very similar role, because of the fact that they are a predator and they are a carnivore. So not only are we going to talk about how they're a keystone species, we're also going to talk about some cool adaptations that they have that makes them a good predator. And so to start, we'll look at one of the things that's obvious and something that's shared among a lot of carnivorous predators is that they have teeth. So you can see Tick here has some pretty sharp teeth that are found in his mouth, and they actually have a lot. They can have up to 80 teeth at a time. And they also have a really, really strong bite force. So we can measure the bite force of an alligator in what's in some units called pounds per square inch. And so just to put it in perspective, you and me, humans, we have a bite force of about 150 pounds per square inch, whereas an alligator is close to 3,000. So they have a really strong bite force. They have about 80 teeth at a time. So as you can imagine, they're pretty good at eating things. And so they're also generalists. They'll eat pretty much anything they can get their mouths on. So that can be anything from turtles to fish, small mammals, birds, you name it. If they can get their mouths on it, they're probably going to eat it. And so that's one reason that they do have a really big impact on their environment. So they are a keystone species. There's been some really cool research done on full ecosystem food webs in areas like cypress swamps, and they found that actually the species that had the most impact on total number of other species further down in the food web was an American alligator relative to other predators within the same environment. So they had an impact on more other species than any other animal or predator within that same ecosystem. So they were able to show that, amphibian numbers increased in the presence of an alligator. And that was because these alligators were eating animals that were in between those two trophic levels, in between the trophic level of an alligator and things that were further down, such as the tadpoles. So when alligators eat turtles and snakes, animals that are commonly going to feed on, or fish that are going to commonly feed on amphibians, they kind of control those mid-level predators, and that allows the animals lower on the trophic scale to really increase in numbers, and it just improves diversity overall. So they are a keystone species within their environment. They do a good job at eating things, and that in turn controls other animals within that environment and allows for greater diversity and even abundance or total number of animals that are also found there. So some other cool adaptations, and you can kind of see, so if you look at the end of Tick's nose, you can kind of see the bump, and that's his nostrils that are raised up. That's a good view. So you can kind of see his nostrils are raised up just like his eyes are. And what that does is that allows Tick to be able to breathe through his nostrils while pretty much the rest of his body is submerged. So that way he can kind of wait and see who's going to walk close enough to the edge of the water to get some water as a resource, and then he's going to be able to snap up and grab them. So that's a cool example of an adaptation that a carnivore has to make them good hunters and good predators, right? So we're going to talk about lots of other adaptations that animals have that make them good hunters and effective at catching prey, which is the food they are going to eat, or the other animals they are going to eat. But before we move on past Tick, we can also talk about, since we have been, we're talking about keystone species, they are not keystone species just because of the role they play as a predator or as a carnivore. They also have a little bit of an ecosystem engineer effect going, where they make these large gator holes that can be 65 feet long, and they do that to kind of rest in, maybe to cool down in when it gets hot, or even to kind of go into a little bit of a hibernation mode or a cooling down mode when it gets cold. But they don't always stay in those gator holes, so they make them for when they need them, and then they'll eventually move out of them. But what's important about those gator holes is that they will fill up with water, and they will retain water even when other areas start drying out. So if there's any kind of a drought period, they're going to be able to retain water. And so animals will move into those gator holes and use that water source as a site of refuge, a place to stay safe and stay wet if all the other water is drying up. And that can protect animals from drying out, and it can be really important for maintaining populations. So that habitat feature that they create also supports other animals. And then kind of on the flip side of a gator hole is they make nests that are raised above the ground rather than built into the ground. And so they make these nests out of vegetation that stick up 3.5 feet and about 6 feet wide. And that can kind of play the opposite role. Let's say if it starts to flood up, then animals can retreat to these nests to get above the water. And also other animals will just use their nests as good places to lay their own eggs and raise their young. So like turtles will lay their eggs within gator nests if they're not occupied anymore. And so just really cool species. Another example of a keystone species, and definitely a predator, right? Okay, awesome. All right, give me 1 second. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. We're going to move on. Okay, so we've talked about keystone species now. That's one way that carnivores can be really important for their environment. It's really cool. Let's talk about other carnivores that we have here at Cheetah Park and Zoo at our facility where we're talking from today. And so I'm going to play this video. And so this is a cheetah, and a cheetah is one of those animals that I was talking about that's considered an obligate carnivore. So they solely rely on eating flesh and animal material. And then what I really want you to focus on right now, since we're talking about adaptations that make carnivores really effective too, is this is a really cool video of how fast they can move. And you can see different features that help them with that. So take note of their really long tails. They can use those tails as rudders while they're running to kind of help them steer and maintain balance. They have a flexible spine that also allows them to make some sharp turns and movements when they're getting into really high speeds. I'll show you the skull in a second. They have really enlarged nostrils that allow them to take in a lot of oxygen really fast. And that's really important because this is the fastest land mammal. So they can go from 0 to 60 to 70 miles an hour in just 3 seconds. But to be able to do something that impressive, they need to be able to take in a lot of air, a lot of oxygen really fast. So they have really enlarged nostrils that allow them to do that. But then, they're carnivores. So after they make their hunt or catch their prey, they need to cool down too, right? Because then they're going to be really vulnerable because they essentially may have just overheated themselves by going so fast in such a short amount of time. So this is the skull of a cheetah. You can kind of see where the enlarged nostrils would be found. And then we talked about with tick as well, right? Something that may be common among a lot of our carnivores that are feeding on meat is the teeth. So they have these really big canine teeth that allow them to puncture prey and kind of tear flesh, which is kind of scary, right? But it's what these animals do. They're effective predators, and that allows them to, make their hunt successful. And so this is kind of cool to look at what's underneath all that cheetah skin, that really pretty cheetah skin, as you can see with this skull. So they're very cool animals, and everything about them is built to be able to get up to those really fast speeds, catch their prey, and then cool down faster again because of those large nostrils that are also going to allow them to cool down. They have semi-retractable claws. So what I have here is the print of a cheetah, and you can see where those claws are going to be at the end of each finger paw pad. And so what that does, that essentially acts as a cleat that allows them to get really good grip on the ground as they're propelling themselves forward really fast. So that also makes them really effective at moving at such high speeds, and making sure they maintain traction. I think that's pretty much, oh, and then one other big thing about cheetahs is they have really good eyesight. So when they're out in the environment and they're out in those grasslands, wherever they may be hunting, what's really important is that compared to other big cats, they're one of the more diurnal species, which means they may hunt during the day a little bit more, whereas other animals may hunt when it's starting to get dark, where they may have an advantage. But cheetahs will hunt during the day. And so if you ever see a cheetah, I don't know if we'll be able to see in that video, but they have kind of black teardrops coming off their eyes. And what that does is that kind of acts like, if you ever see football players put the black underneath their eyes, it kind of helps reduce glare from the sun. And so that helps them see better. And that having really good eyesight is important because, right, they only have so much time before they're gonna overheat. So they have to make their hunt count, and they only have so much time to catch their prey. So they have to make sure they're really locked in and they can see really well, so that as soon as they decide they're going to make that chase, they are locked in and they have good vision to follow through with that hunt. So really cool animal. We just talked about lots of adaptations that they have that make them effective carnivores. So yeah. All right, I'm going to share my screen again. Sorry, bear with me. I want to make sure I can show you everything cool that we have. All right, so that's at Cheetah. Let's jump over to one of our other facilities. So I'm also an educator at the aquarium, which is nice because that means we get to bring you some cool footage from there as well. So this is from the Blue Hole exhibit, and what I want you to focus on is this animal right in front here right now. So this is a Gulf sturgeon, and very different than what we just saw, right? The cheetah or even the gray wolf or the alligator. It's a very slow moving looking fish, right? But they are also considered carnivores. So they don't eat plant material, right? They eat things like mollusks, like snails maybe in the water. They may eat worms on the bottom, crustaceans, so things like shrimp, crabs, things like that. So they eat a lot of animals in the water that's going to be found on the bottom. So they're considered bottom feeders too. And so whenever one comes by again, you'll notice they have barbels kind of hanging below them. And that's because their mouth is positioned underneath them. Let's see if I can show you. Oh no, it's not gonna let me drag that. But anyway, so they're bottom feeders, but they're still considered carnivores, right? I mean, they're eating invertebrates, which aren't plant material. And so you can kind of see the one that's swimming by now. You can see those barbels hanging below, and they're positioned in front of the mouth. So those are sensory. That allows them to feel what's on the ground below them, and that's going to be important for them finding prey and feeding, especially since they're a bit more slow moving. And then what I also want you to take note of is we have another kind of, so behind the sturgeon that just swam by, you'll see that long fish with the really pointy nose kind of and mouth. So that's what we call a gar that we also have in our Blue Hole. And that's going to fall in that one of those categories that I talked about earlier called a piscivore. So that is more of a predatory fish. They have a lot of sharp teeth in their mouth. And so they are going to actually hunt fish rather than just being, kind of opportunistic like the Gulf sturgeon, just cruising around the bottom and feeling what they can eat and, feeding on what they come across. Those gar are actually going to dart forward and they're going to actually hunt their prey. So kind of cool, different variation just within our Blue Hole, showing you two different other kinds of carnivores that we've switched off land now. So by no means does all of our carnivores have to be terrestrial or on land. They can also be in the water. Okay. So, oh, I ruined it. I ruined the surprise. Let's see. I think we had a question. Yes. So that's a really good question. So the question was, how do carnivores get the vitamins and nutrients they need? Do they need the same things we do, or can they survive without the kind of nutrients we get from plants? So essentially, energy is gonna move up the food chain. So as you know, an herbivore eats plant material, it's gonna acquire nutrients from those plants, and they're gonna pass it further up the food chain. So inevitably those plants are supplying the rest of the energy that moves further up the food chain. And it's kind of interesting to think about because every time a trophic scale moves up and energy gets passed to a new trophic scale, only about 10% of that energy and nutrients is passed along. So a lot is lost as heat, which is kind of weird to think about, but you know, like it costs energy to convert that food that you eat into nutrients and energy, right? And so when you're turning that food that you consume into energy, you lose some of it, and so only so much is going to be passed each time you go up the trophic scale. It's a great question. Okay, let's go back to our PowerPoint. So actually, the largest carnivore is a blue whale. So really incredible animals. They can be up to 100 feet long, 200 tons, which to put that in perspective is about 400,000 pounds. So, you know, we only weigh 100 to a couple hundred pounds. They weigh 400,000 pounds. And they get these huge sizes just by filter feeding, which means they just cruise around through the water column and open their mouth and take in large gulps of water, and they'll filter out as they're taking in those large gulps of water just little krill, which are just little shrimp-like animals that I also have pictured here. And so that's how the largest carnivore in the world gets all of its food. It's just by filtering out little krill that's found in the water. So pretty incredible to think about. And so I figured I'd throw that in there because why not throw in the biggest carnivore while we're talking about them? All right. And now let's talk about other roles that carnivores can play. So not all carnivores may necessarily hunt things and actually seek out their food or even swim around. So we don't necessarily think about, right, that blue whale hunting things because it's just swimming around and filter feeding. But either way, it's still actively catching things. But not all animals may do that. We may have other animals such as scavengers. So what you see here are vultures and hyenas. I have a hyena up in that top right-hand corner. And then we have a beetle in the top left-hand corner that's called a burying beetle. And all of these animals are scavengers, which means they will find dead animal material and they will feed on that. So vultures will wait until an animal, you know, another animal, say maybe like a cheetah has killed something and is done feeding on it and leaves it behind. They will come in and they will pick off anything that's left over and they will feed on it and they will pretty much pick it clean and they'll feed that way. Hyenas are actually very interesting in that they'll eat meat and the flesh as well, especially if they can get their hands on it, and they'll oftentimes maybe even like go in and hunt themselves or try to scare whatever animal made the hunt and just get the whole meal itself. But if they do just find something that's left over, what's really interesting is they can eat the bones too. So they can really clean up a site and make it look nice and clean. Otherwise, there would just be bones everywhere, especially when there's a lot of hunting going on. So they're really cool that way. And then the burying beetle is also really cool in that if they find an animal that's left over, they'll take it and they'll bury it and then they'll lay their eggs near it so that when their little larva, their little worm-like pupae or larva, when they hatch out of their eggs, they'll have that food source right there ready to be eaten. So that's kind of cool and interesting that these beetles will actually dig around whatever they find to kind of drop it into the ground and protect it, and they'll like bury it. That's why they're called a burying beetle, and they'll bury it to keep it hidden from other animals, and then they'll lay their eggs right there. So as soon as their little young hatch out, they have food readily available. But so 3 different kinds of scavengers. There's other scavengers out there. But what's really important about them is that another way, so I was talking about how energy is lost each time food goes up the trophic scales. Another big source of energy being lost from ecosystems is just leftover meat that's never consumed. That's where scavengers come into play. They'll actually come and they'll consume that meat. And so they're actually going to be able to recycle those nutrients back into the ecosystem. So it's not going to waste, which is really nice, right? And they just clean up areas in general. So there's not a lot of things just laying around. So that's also nice. But the big one is that, they are able to break down this material that's left over and might make other animals sick, right? And they can get it recycled back into the ecosystem. And oftentimes even in forms that plants can use and benefit from so that they can keep making plant material and supplying the rest of that food web all the way up. And then just really quick too, I said we were going to talk about lots of adaptations that animals have that make them effective carnivores. So what you see on the right there is an eastern screech owl. And what I want you to really notice is his talons. So a lot of animals, we were saying a lot of carnivores have teeth. That's useful for tearing flesh and eating meat. Owls have talons, which are really useful for catching prey and puncturing that prey, so that they make sure they can hold on to them really tight and be able to bring them back to wherever they're going to eat their food, because they don't want to just eat it and be exposed. And then they also have curved beaks a lot. You can't really see it too well in this picture, but that curved beak is just as good kind of as teeth at being able to tear apart flesh and be able to feed off of that. So owls are also have some cool adaptations that will allow them to be good carnivores. And then a lot of other animals have venom. So snakes like this eastern diamondback rattlesnake have venom that they can inject into their prey to paralyze them. And that way it can't get away. And then they have time to feed on their prey. Another cool thing about snakes is that they can unhinge their mouths really large to be able to feed on things that are even bigger than their head is. So that makes them effective carnivores. Spiders will make webs so that they can catch food and eat it. That makes them a good carnivore. Lots of adaptations. So I just want to throw a couple more in there to get you guys to realize how many adaptations there are out there and how diverse carnivores can be. And then lastly, we've been talking all about animals, which is fun, right? I'm a big animal person myself, but let's not forget about carnivorous plants. So this is actually really interesting to me. I'm sure some of you have heard of a Venus flytrap, and so that's the picture on the bottom left. And so that's a plant that has sensitive hairs on it that you can kind of see. And if those hairs are triggered, or if they feel something, that Venus flytrap is going to snap shut on whatever may have touched the hairs. So it may be things like a fly, it may be other insects, and then they are going to digest whatever food gets trapped within that plant. So really cool. And then the other one I have pictured here in the top right, that red one, that red to pink color, is called a sundew. And so what those little droplets and hairs are that you see, is that they have a sticky material on them, almost like glue. And so if an animal flies into that really sticky material, they're going to get stuck. And then that also gives time for that plant to pull in whatever prey it caught and digest it and feed off of that animal. So really cool. Can't ignore our plants, right? Especially in a topic like this where we actually have carnivorous plants. Another really cool one that you may see is a pitcher plant. Those are those kind of long tunnel-like plants that you can see sometimes near like bogs or things like that, where animals will fly in and they'll get stuck in the serum. That's also a carnivorous plant. But I didn't want to leave those out. And with that, that is all I have for you. I'm going to check to see if we have any other questions. And it says, do carnivorous plants still need sunlight? That's a really good question. So yes, so they still need to be able to grow, and you can still see that they have green on them, right? Which means they have chlorophyll and they're still using sunlight as an energy source. But this is an additional way for them to get energy and get some food in their system. But that's a really good question. Okay, I think that's all we have. So thanks so much for joining us today for our Carnivores talk. I hope you enjoyed it and you all learned something today, and we hope to see you all soon. Thanks so much.